Welcome to the Big Sky. I'm Anthony Crescenzo. Let's start with the conference standings. The Lumberjacks, who stayed undefeated, are now at the top of the heap. Now, on a 4-game win streak is Southern Utah, who's probably surprising the entire FCS. And the Eagles, who were on the bye, fall to 3rd place. This week's Players of the Week are Jake Meyer of UC Davis, Jordan Prater of Weber State, and John Santiago of North Dakota. Now, on offense, Meyer threw for his career high of 459 yards with 2 touchdowns in the Aggies' win over Cal Poly. The Defensive Player of the Week, Jordan Prater, had 2 interceptions, one being a pick 6 in the Wildcats' victory over Montana, who they knocked out of the top 25 this week. It's Prater's second 2-pick day of the season. And the Big Sky Special Teams Player of the Week, Jonathan Santiago, whose name we haven't said enough this season. He totaled 200 all-purpose yards, including a 64-yard punt return for a touchdown in the Fighting Hawks' victory at Portland State. It's his third 200-plus yard game of this season. He leads the FCS with just under 1,500 yards. This week, you can catch Eastern Washington hosting Weber State, and I'm sure that both of these teams are going to be out for blood. Weber is streaking up the ladder, and the Eagles lost their first conference game in 2 years, right before their bye week. This could have easily been the game of the week. North Dakota will be at Southern Utah. The Vikings will go to Cal Poly. Montana will host Kennesaw State in a non-conference matchup. Northern Colorado will travel to Sac State. UC Davis visits Idaho State. And the Big Sky Game of the Week, NAU at Montana. The Grizzlies have been struggling on the road, but they're back home. Their quarterback, Gresh Jensen, who's on Stats Watch list for the Jerry Rice Award, is hoping that the home field advantage will help. NAU's Case Cookus, who won the award in 2015, is coming off of a 400-yard game, and the Lumberjacks defense had 2 pick sixes last week. Both teams have been on the stats list for the top teams in passing offense and tackles for loss. Expect big plays downfield and obviously sacks. You can check out more from the Big Sky at bigskyconf, that's CONF.com.
Week 9 in the Big South was an exciting one, with Liberty, Kennesaw State, and Monmouth all picking up big conference road wins. The Owls win earned them a spot in the Stats FCS Top 25. Here's how each team picked up their victory. Liberty snapped their 4-game losing streak with a 33-17 win at Gardner-Webb. The Flames' offense looked like it did in the beginning of the season, with their big-time players making big-time plays. Quarterback Stephen Calvert threw for 333 yards and 2 scores. The touchdowns went to his favorite targets, Antonio Gandy Golden and Damian King, who both had over 100 yards receiving. Carrington Mosley had a big day on the ground with 123 yards on 20 carries and 2 scores. On the defensive side, junior cornerback Jeremy Peters picked off 3 Tyrell Maxwell passes and returned 1 for a touchdown. His efforts earned him Big South Defensive Player of the Week. For the running Bulldogs, Jalen Cagle ran for 179 yards on 24 carries and a score in the loss. Kennesaw State extended their winning streak to 7 games with a 28-0 shutout over Presbyterian. Dual-threat quarterback Chandler Burks accounted for all 4 Owls scores. He completed 5 of 11 for 93 yards and a touchdown, and added 78 yards on the ground on 14 carries and 3 more scores. Burks earned Big South Offensive Player of the Week honors. On the other side, Will Brock replaced Ben Cheek in the second half for the Blue Hose, throwing for 77 yards while completing 7 of his 14 attempts. In the Game of the Week, Monmouth took down 2-time defending Big South champs Charleston Southern, 23-20, to remain undefeated in conference play. Quarterback Kenji Bahar continued his hot play, completing 20 for 34 for 221 yards and a score. The touchdown pass went to freshman running back Eric Zakori, who caught 3 passes for 69 yards and added 29 yards on the ground. His efforts earned him his second straight Big South Rookie of the Week award. Cameron Brown caught 5 passes for 123 yards for the Bucks in the loss. Before we head into Week 10, let's check out the Big South standings. Kennesaw State leads the way at 3-0. Monmouth is the only other undefeated team at 2-0. Charleston Southern is third at 1-1, Liberty fourth at 1-2, and Presbyterian and Gardner-Webb bring up the rear, both sitting at 0-2. 7-1 Kennesaw State travels out of conference to take on 4-4 Montana State on Saturday as they bring their new ranking with them. The Owls come in to this week ranked 25th in the Stats FCS Top 25, ending a run of 4 straight weeks without a ranked Big South team. The Owls are third in the FCS, forcing 16 interceptions this year, and will have their hands full with Bobcats dual-threat quarterback Chris Murray, who leads the team in both passing and rushing yards. Kennesaw has a pretty good dual-threat QB of their own in Chandler Burks, who's coming off a great performance from a week ago. They'll need to rely on him and their strong secondary if they're going to run their winning streak up to 8 straight. 4-4 Liberty is also out of conference this weekend, and they'll host 7-1 and the leaders of the Northeast Conference, Duquesne. The Dukes come in winners of 7 straight. If you like high-scoring games and touchdown passes, this is the game for you. Both teams come in averaging over 33 points per contest, and both quarterbacks rank in the top 6 in touchdown passes. Stephen Calvert for the Flames is second with 23. And Tommy Stewart for the Dukes is 6th with 22. 3-5 Presbyterian travels to Monmouth to take on the 7-1 Hawks on Saturday. This is just the 4th meeting between the two schools, with the Blue Hose leading the all-time series 2-1. Monmouth has scored 78 points in their 2 conference wins, while Presbyterian has yet to score in their 2 losses. Hawks quarterback Kenji Bahar has been hot, throwing a TD pass in 6 straight games with a total of 9 in that span. The Blue Hose are heading into unfamiliar territory as they have not played a game on the road since their season opener on August 31st. That's a span of 65 straight days in between road trips. In the Big South's other matchup, 4-4 Charleston Southern heads to Gardner-Webb to face the 1-7 running Bulldogs. Gardner-Webb leads the all-time series 10-6. This matchup features 2 passing offenses that rank near the bottom according to the Stats FCS, but on the other side, both rushing attacks rank inside the top 20. Gardner-Webb relies mainly on Tyrell Maxwell, the conference's rushing leader with 668 yards, while the Bucks will use more of a balanced attack, as they have 4 different backs with over 250 yards each. The difference could come from the defensive line play, and Charleston Southern has the advantage there. That's all for this week in the Big South. Come back next week for all the results and more. For the FCS Conference Whiparound, I'm Frank LaSalle.
The top echelon of the Colonial Athletic Association has separated itself after a wild week with some top 25 matchups. A couple wild upsets really changed the outlook going forward for not only this conference but the top 25 as a whole. Looking at the standings, James Madison and Elon remain tied for first at 5-0. Stony Brook sits alone in second place at 5-1. Delaware and New Hampshire are both 3-2. Maine is alone at 3-3. Richmond and Villanova are a disappointing 2-3. Albany, Towson, and Rhode Island all have 1 conference win, and at the bottom of the conference, William & Mary is winless. In our first matchup, Maine dominated William & Mary 23-6. The Black Bears held the tribe under 200 total yards. Maine will look to make it 4 straight conference wins against Delaware next week, while William & Mary will be searching for their first conference win against New Hampshire. Rhode Island finally got their first conference win last week, taking down Albany easily 31-14. Rhode Island's defense held Albany to 125 total yards and 1 offensive touchdown in an impressive performance. Both teams have much tougher games next week. Rhode Island will be matched up against a top-ranked Dukes, and Albany takes on an underrated Stony Brook team. Towson, like Rhode Island, also picked up their first conference win against Delaware 18-17. Robert Hayward had 12 tackles for the Tigers, helping lead this defense to victory. Caney Kane and Kareem Williams combined for 193 rushing yards and a touchdown in the Blue Hens' upset loss. Towson will have a much tougher matchup against the Elon Phoenix, whereas Delaware will like to bounce back against Maine. James Madison shut out New Hampshire 21-0 to make it 20 straight games. Brian Shore didn't have a great game, but he set a new school record for touchdown passes at 53. The Dukes defense held the Wildcats to 193 total yards. James Madison will look to keep it rolling against a feisty Rhode Island team. New Hampshire will look to bounce back against William & Mary. Stony Brook solidified themselves as a top team in the nation, beating Richmond 27-24. Wide receiver Ray Bolden had 13 receptions for 118 yards and 2 touchdowns in a career day, helping lift his team to a top 25 win. Kyle Lauletta continues to dominate in a tough loss, throwing for 310 yards and 3 scores. He tied the school's record for most touchdown passes in a season with 26. Richmond has another tough matchup against Villanova, and Stony Brook takes on Albany. In the best game of the week in the CAA, Elon took down Villanova in a fun back-and-forth 19-14 win. The Phoenix now have 4 wins over ranked opponents this season. Davis Cheek and Cortez Weeks were absolutely dominant. Cheek threw for a career-high 357 yards and 2 touchdowns. Weeks had 11 receptions for a career-high 205 yards. Villanova will look to salvage their playoff hopes against Richmond next week. Elon, who has now legitimized themselves as a top 10 team, will look to make it 8 straight wins against Towson. With your FCS Conference Whiparound, I'm Ryan Griffith. Good luck to the CAA this weekend.
Another huge week of Ivy League football in the books. Let's take a quick look at last week's action. First off, Penn took on Brown with both teams hoping to get their first in-conference win of the season. Behind senior receiver Justin Watson's 8 catches for 132 yards and 2 scores, Penn was able to take down the Bears 17-7. Next up, Dartmouth traveled to Cambridge to take on Harvard in an important game for the Big Green after losing a top spot in the conference last week to Columbia. Dartmouth has been great this year in closing out close games, but that wasn't the case as this week they blew a 14-0 first-half lead to Harvard. The Crimson rallied behind freshman quarterback Jake Smith's 3 touchdown passes and a late interception by Tanner Lee as Harvard took this game 25-22 over Dartmouth. Princeton welcomed in Cornell to Jersey last week, looking to get a win and stay in the race for first place in the Ivy League. The Big Red weren't having any of that as they rallied late in this one, scoring 13 unanswered points in the fourth quarter and took the lead with 48 seconds left on a 43-yard field goal by Nicholas Null as they took down the Tigers 29-28. Finally, we get to last week's game of the week. Yale took on unbeaten Columbia at home, trying to take sole possession of first place in the Ivy League. Yale jumped out to an early lead in this one and never looked back. Led by running back Zane Dedek's 218 total yards, Yale was able to take this one handily over the Lions by the score of 23-6. As for Dedek, his performance was good enough to earn him FCS Freshman Player of the Week. He finished with 173 rushing yards, 45 receiving yards, and most importantly, a win over first place Columbia. Let's take a look at the standings after last week's action. Things are looking a lot different after last week. As you'll notice, Yale is in first place for the first time this season. Another big winner from last week was Cornell, who is only 3-4 on the season, but all of those wins have come in conference. Now, after last week's win over Princeton, they find themselves sitting at 3rd place in the Ivy League. Finally, here are matchups for next week. First place Yale welcomes in last place Brown, hoping to extend their lead over the conference even more. Columbia goes back home to take on Harvard in what will be an important game as the Lions need a bounce-back win to stay amongst the elite in the conference. Penn hosts Princeton this week and will be looking to play spoiler as the Tigers need every win they can to stay in the conversation for first place in the Ivy League. Dartmouth hosts Cornell as both teams are in desperate need of a win to keep pace in the conference. That's it for our coverage of the Ivy League. For Football Game Plan's FCS Whiparound, I'm Ian Gridley, and I'll see you next week.
What an outstanding Week 9 in the Mid-Eastern Atlantic Conference. We saw a blowout, we saw a team earn its first victory of the season, and my MEAC Game of the Week was as exciting as advertised. But first, let's start with Ryan Stanley throwing for 286 yards and 3 scores as he leads Florida A&M past Morgan State 34-31. Chad Hunter goes off for 140 yards receiving and a touchdown for the Rattlers as they overcome early mistakes and defeat the Bears. Howard made a 21-0 first quarter lead hold up as they beat South Carolina State. Kaylin Newton's 94-yard touchdown pass to Jaquez Izzard helps the Bison keep rolling. North Carolina Central bounces back from its first conference loss in 19 games and blows out Delaware State 42-14. Chauncey Caldwell accounts for 4 touchdowns as the Eagles get by the Hornets in convincing fashion. Behind a terrific defensive effort, Savannah State beat Norfolk State to earn their first win of the season and their first road win since 2011. Adam Brown's 29-yard game-tying field goal attempt at the end of regulation was not to be as the Hampton Pirates fall to Bethune-Cookman 24-21 in my MEAC Game of the Week. Let's go to the standings. North Carolina A&T stays at the top as they were on a bye. North Carolina Central, Hampton, and Howard, all 4-1 in the conference, sit behind the Aggies. Bethune-Cookman, Norfolk State, and Florida A&M are right in the middle of the pack. Looking ahead, Week 10 has some interesting matchups. North Carolina A&T looks to stay unbeaten as they go into William Price Stadium in Norfolk, Virginia, and take on the Spartans. Howard will go for their 4th straight win as they take on Florida A&M in Tallahassee. Bethune-Cookman, looking to improve their 3-2 conference record, plays host to 1-win Morgan State. 5-3 Hampton welcomes 6-2 North Carolina Central in my MEAC Game of the Week. I'm Arthur Schneiderman for FootballGamePlan.com.
Coming down the stretch in the Northeast Conference, there are still 3 teams with a real shot to take home the title. And 2 games this weekend will go a long way in deciding who gets to call themselves champions this year. Let's take a look at the standings as we tell you about the results of last week's games and games coming up this weekend. At the top, we see Duquesne, a win ahead of Central Connecticut, who had an open date last week. Duquesne, with a big day from the Hari Crawford, defeated Sacred Heart 37-21 last weekend. Crawford was my NEC Offensive Player of the Week, as he caught 6 balls for 143 yards and a touchdown, and is now in a 3-way tie atop the national leaderboard with 11 touchdown receptions on the year. St. Francis, thanks in large part to Louis Gartner's second turnover return for a touchdown this season, defeated Robert Morris 36-7 last weekend, and sits a game behind Duquesne. The Red Flash can get right back in the thick of the race this weekend, though, as they travel to New Britain to take on Central Connecticut. A win means St. Francis will be rooting for the Blue Devils next weekend at Duquesne. A Central Connecticut win means that game next weekend at Duquesne will be for the NEC title. Bryant, after a 36-21 victory at Wagner, will be playing Sacred Heart in an elimination game this weekend. The loser is out of the race, while the winner still has an outside shot at a partial NEC title. In the win over Wagner, linebacker Thomas Costigan had 11 total tackles, 10 of which were solo, to go with 2 sacks and a forced fumble, earning him my NEC Defensive Player of the Week. In other action this upcoming weekend, Robert Morris and Wagner will both be looking for their first NEC victory this year as they face off on Staten Island. For the FCS Conference Whiparound, I'm Luke Jackson.
We all know it goes down in the Missouri Valley Football Conference. Right now, there is a good 6 teams vying for a playoff berth, with about 2 to 3 still in contention for the outright title. Offensively speaking, this has been a fantastic year overall without sacrificing the tough defenses that this conference has been known for. As we look at the standings, everyone is chasing the Bison, who are undefeated on the season. But like I mentioned before, Illinois State, South Dakota State, and even Northern Iowa are still in the hunt for the top spot. I'm also willing to bet that we'll see 4 teams from the Missouri Valley Football Conference get into the playoffs. This week on the schedule, there are some pivotal matchups that could begin to iron some things out within this conference. Games like South Dakota, Northern Iowa, Western traveling to Illinois State, and the Dakota marker game between North Dakota State and South Dakota State. Also, will this be the week that Indiana State gets its first victory of the season? We shall see.
Only 3 weeks remain on the schedule in the Ohio Valley Conference, and teams with playoff hopes need to start showing the committee why they deserve a shot at the final FCS 24. Eastern Illinois' hopes of being part of that 24 took a shot this past weekend in Martin, Tennessee, as the Skyhawks of UT Martin defeated the Panthers 27-10. Turnovers did in EIU, as they committed 5 throughout the game. It was a sloppy game all around, as there were 20 accepted penalties, and the teams were combined 4 for 24 on 3rd down. UT Martin's Khalid Hagans earned himself my OVC Defensive Player of the Week award, though, as he made 6 tackles, including 2.5 for a loss, grabbed an interception, and produced a strip sack that resulted in a 17-yard fumble return touchdown. And he did all that in 1 half before he left with an injury. Now, as we look at the standings, we see that the loss, combined with Jacksonville State's win over Southeast Missouri State, puts Eastern Illinois in a position of needing to win out and hoping that JSU loses the rest of its games for the Panthers to have any shot at an OVC title. Tennessee Tech notched its first victory of the season, beating Tennessee State 30-26 in Cookeville last Saturday. Offense abounded in that one, but 2 stars really shined, as Patrick Smith caught 7 balls for 152 yards and 3 touchdowns for TSU, and Andrew Goldsmith filled up the stat line for Tennessee Tech, rushing 12 times for 101 yards, catching a pass for 5 yards, and throwing a 27-yard touchdown. Patrick and Andrew share my OVC Offensive Player of the Week award. Now that Tennessee Tech victory means that Austin Peay can win the Sergeant York Trophy outright this Saturday in Cookeville, as they will take on the Golden Eagles. The Governors will be coming off a tough loss at the University of Central Florida, but at 5-4 on the season, they have only lost to FBS schools and Jacksonville State. So their playoff hopes are not by any means slim. And with a strong showing in the last 3 weeks, Austin Peay just might slip into that last 24. In the other conference game from last weekend, Eastern Kentucky evened its OVC record at 3-3 with a 26-13 win at Murray State. For the FCS Conference Whiparound, I'm Luke Jackson.
Last week, we saw a couple of close games and one blowout. Colgate won 40-3 over Bucknell. Fordham beat Lehigh 45-35 in a thriller. Fordham's sophomore running back D'Angelo Palladino rushed for 297 yards, including a 45-yard touchdown late in the fourth quarter that put the game away. Let's take a look at the current standings. We have Colgate leading the way at 3-1, Lehigh and Lafayette both tied at 2-1, Fordham and Holy Cross in the middle at 2-2, Bucknell behind them at 1-2, and Georgetown bringing up the rear at 0-3. This week we only have 3 conference games in action, but with only a few games remaining, the stakes are still high. The Lehigh Mountain Hawks take on Bucknell at noon. Lehigh's top-ranked offense faces off against Bucknell's top-ranked defense in this huge Patriot League showdown. Bucknell's hosting homecoming weekend, so they don't want to disappoint their alumni and fans in this one. With 4 homecoming wins in the last 5 years, the Bison have been hot at home. Even though Lehigh lost to Fordham last week, they still control their own destiny, so if they win out, they will finish as Patriot League champions for a second straight year. If junior running back Dom Bragalone rushes for 137 more yards, he'll be the first player in team history with 3 1,000-yard seasons. He had 218 yards in the battle versus the Rams to set him up to go for the record this week. The Holy Cross Crusaders face off with Fordham at 1 p.m. Rams running back D'Angelo Palladino was named Patriot League Player of the Week after his stellar performance in the win last week. With Holy Cross coming to town, he's going to need another huge game to keep Fordham in the title race with a few games to go. With the Rams owning the tiebreaker over Lehigh, they could still win the title, but they need to win all of their remaining games and hope for Colgate to lose one of theirs. Holy Cross is ending the season with matchups against the toughest teams. After taking on Fordham this week, they have another huge matchup with a rival next week in Lehigh. The winner in this week's game will be handed the Ram Crusader Cup, which is given out annually to the winner of the matchup. Last year, Fordham won big, and the game was held at Yankee Stadium. Lafayette travels to Washington, D.C. to battle with Georgetown for their matchup at 2 o'clock. Normally, teams dominate coming off their bye week, but Lafayette is only 1-2 in the last few seasons, so Georgetown will surely be using that as added motivation going into this game. Senior linebacker Brandon Bryant is second in the nation in tackles and third for solo tackles, so he's a force to be reckoned with. He's also been the Patriot League Defensive Player of the Week 3 consecutive weeks. If Georgetown wants to move that ball on offense, they'll need to look elsewhere on the field to stay away from those turnovers. Last week, the Leopards held Bucknell to 0 offensive touchdowns, but the 2 pick sixes they had made the difference. The defense needs to pick up the good work, but the offense can't leave them stranded this time around. With the FCS Conference Whiparound, I'm Chris Fictel.
As we head into Week 10 in the Pioneer League, it's become a 2-horse race for the playoffs for the automatic conference bid, as a result of some interesting results last week. Campbell lost for a second consecutive week, falling in triple overtime to Jacksonville 54-48. Dayton held off Butler 27-22 in Ohio. Drake earned a key conference win over Davidson 17-12. San Diego held Stetson to just 30 yards on the ground, walking over the Hatters 48-7. And Jimmy Seawald was the star as Valpo beat Morehead State 63-32. Taking a look at the standings going into Week 10, San Diego and Drake have pulled away from the pack after 2 tough losses from Campbell, leading to a possible winner-take-all clash in Week 10. This week, Campbell will look for redemption as they travel to North Carolina to take on Davidson. Stetson will host the Butler Bulldogs. The Red Foxes of Marist will travel to Welcome Stadium to take on the Dayton Flyers. And an entertaining game is sure to be on display as Jacksonville hosts Valparaiso. But this week's key contest will be on the West Coast as San Diego hosts Drake. The Toreros come in undefeated in conference play, and a win over the one-loss Drake Bulldogs will all but certainly punch their ticket to the FCS playoffs with the Pioneer automatic bid. However, a win for Drake would make it a sprint to the finish with the Bulldogs having the head-to-head advantage. For the FCS Conference Whiparound, I'm David Hassagen.
In what was another exciting week in the SoCon saw not one but two upsets. The Furman Paladins took care of the Catamounts of Western Carolina by a score of 28-6. It was extremely wet conditions at E.J. Whitmire Stadium, in which usually indicates a heavy rushing attack, and so it was, as the running backs Antonio Wilcox and Keelan Dirks combined for 321 yards and 3 touchdowns for the Paladins. With their 5th straight win, the Paladins sit alongside Wofford atop the conference standings. We also had the Chattanooga Mocs go into Birmingham and upset the Sanford Bulldogs 23-21. Victor Olmo's late field goal with 19 seconds left sealed the deal for the Mocs. Sanford, coming off an upset win themselves, was plagued by turnovers all game. Quarterback Devlin Hodges threw for 333 yards and 2 touchdowns, but was picked off 3 times. The Wofford Terriers continued their streak of winning close games by holding off East Tennessee State 31-24. The Terriers are now 6-1 in games decided by a touchdown or less. And VMI missed out on their first win of the season, losing 21-3 to the Citadel. All right, folks, let's take a look at the standings. After both coming off wins, Wofford and Furman sit atop the standings at 5-1. Western Carolina and Sanford both suffered tough losses as the Catamounts hold a half-game lead over the Bulldogs. Mercer and the Citadel are keeping pace in the conference, sitting at 3-3 respectively. Chattanooga, East Tennessee, and VMI round out the bottom of the standings. All right, looking at the Week 10 schedule, Wofford looks to pull away in the conference as they take on a hungry Chattanooga Mocs team who look to get their second upset in 2 weeks. I wouldn't be surprised if we have another close game on our hands. Western Carolina takes a trip south to Charleston to take on the Citadel as they try to get back in the win column and in better weather for that matter. VMI, who are still searching for that first win of the season, face the Buccaneers of East Tennessee. And my game of the week is Sanford versus Mercer, and what will feature a very good passing offense in Sanford going up against a stout Mercer defense who is giving up 18.9 points per game, which ranks 18th in the FCS. Expect Mercer's defense to key in on the Bulldogs receivers, forcing the Bulldogs to run the ball more often than not, which may be a difficult task as they rank 113th in the FCS with only 604 rushing yards on the season. Keep an eye on Devlin Hodges in this one as he looks to bounce back from a tough 3-interception game last week. If Hodges and the Bulldogs can get the run game going early on, it will open up the passing attack where he has thrown for a combined 760 yards over the past 2 games. Until next week, for the FCS Conference Whiparound, I'm Chris Strover.
As we get ready for another exciting week of football in the FCS, as Week 10 is upon us, we have a quick recap of what happened this past weekend. The Cowboys and their defense couldn't stop the Bears as they lost 47-17. The Cowboys defense had given up 63 points combined in their previous conference games. Jake Blumwick led Stephen F. Austin to a 34-7 win over the Cardinals. Nichols States and Incarnate Word went back and forth all game, but the Colonels came out on top 38-31. And Sam Houston State defeated the Lions 33-23. We take a look at the FCS stats standings as Central Arkansas remains at the top and undefeated in conference play. We look ahead to Week 10 as the top 3 teams in the standings play against teams who all have 1 win this year, but that doesn't guarantee a win because sometimes in sports anything could happen. We look to Saturday with some early games as the Cardinals take on the Bearcats, 2 p.m. on ESPN3, and at 4:30 the Colonels take on Houston Baptist, while Central Arkansas looks to remain undefeated in conference play as they take on Lamar. You can catch that game on ESPN3 at 7 p.m. I think the intriguing matchup is the Lions versus the Cowboys. These are 2 teams fighting to move up the conference standings, but can the Cowboys defense rebound as they take on another great offense in southeastern Louisiana, who has put up 288 points in conference play, while the Cowboys' offense has only put up 182 points in conference play this year. But their defense is what has kept them in games this year. giving up 18 points per game. For the FCS Whiparound, I'm Doug Sarava.
Week 9 in the SWAC featured 4 conference games and 1 out-of-conference game. Grambling State took care of business behind quarterback Devontae Kincaid's big day in the air. Kincaid threw for 347 yards and 3 touchdowns. He also has a touchdown on the ground, helping Grambling State beat Texas Southern 50-24. Mississippi Valley State took down Jackson State 24-5. Alabama State was victorious in the Magic City Bowl, defeating Alabama A&M 21-16. Last week's SWAC game of the week did not disappoint, as Southern U took down Arkansas Pine Bluff in a shootout 47-40. In the lone out-of-conference game last week in the SWAC, Prairie View A&M defeated Bacone College 34-17. Taking a look at the standings in the SWAC, coming off a bye week, Alcorn State remains first in the East. Alabama A&M is still second in the standings, even after falling to Alabama State. Switching over to the West, Grambling State is still atop the standings, improving their record to 4-0 in conference play. Week 10 in the SWAC features a full slate of conference games. In the first conference game of the week, winless Texas Southern travels to Rice-Totten Stadium to take on the Delta Devils. Fresh off their win against Alabama A&M, Alabama State looks to keep things rolling against Jackson State. This week's SWAC game of the week features Prairie View A&M up against Southern U. Expect a shootout in that one. The game with the most conference implications this week is Alabama A&M versus Alcorn State. If Alabama A&M comes out of this one victorious, they will leapfrog Alcorn State in the standings and move into first place in the Eastern Conference. The final game on the Week 10 slate for the SWAC Conference is number 15th ranked Grambling State on the road against Arkansas Pine Bluff. For the FCS Whiparound, I'm Max Bazzone.